Every morning at 11 a.m., Jordan stood at the same street corner. Jordan reached the corner at 10:57 a.m. He always arrived 3 minutes early. At 10:57, Jordan stopped walking and positioned himself near the curb. At 10:58, Jordan adjusted his coat once and placed both hands inside the pockets. At 10:59, Jordan became still. At 11 a.m. exactly, Jordan stood in place without moving. He did not look at his phone. He did not wear a watch. He did not need either. He had memorized this part of the day. The street corner looked the same every morning. The traffic light hung above the intersection. The paint on the pole was chipped. The curb showed years of wear. Jordan had noticed all of this long ago. At 11:01 a.m., Jordan looked straight ahead. He did not scan the street. He did not look for the bus yet. He kept his eyes forward and waited. At 11:02 a.m., a few people walked past Jordan. A man in a dark jacket crossed the street without looking at him. A woman slowed briefly near the curb, then continued walking. Jordan did not acknowledge them. He kept his posture steady. At 11:03 a.m., Jordan shifted his weight slightly, from his right foot to his left. He did this every morning. It was not discomfort. It was habit. He looked up at the traffic light. It was red. Jordan did not react. He had already seen it red many times before. He looked down the street to his left. The bus appeared in the distance. Jordan watched the bus as it approached. He did not step forward. He did not step back. He remained exactly where he was. The bus moved closer. The sound of the engine grew louder. At 11:06 a.m., the bus stopped near the curb. He looked directly at the bus. Jordan watched the doors open. At 11:06 a.m., people began to board. Jordan watched a man with a backpack step onto the bus. Jordan watched a woman hold the handrail as she climbed the steps. Jordan watched a young couple enter without speaking. He did not move. The bus remained stopped. The doors stayed open. The driver looked ahead. Jordan felt his chest tighten slightly. He did not change his expression. At 11:07 a.m., he stayed in place. Jordan knew he could reach the bus in a few steps. He knew his legs would still respond. He did not test that thought. He kept his feet planted. The bus doors closed and bus pulled away from the curb. Jordan breathed out. The breath was slow and controlled. He did not sigh. He did not lower his head. He simply released the air from his lungs. At 11:09 a.m., Jordan was late. He was late by design. He was not confused about the schedule. He knew exactly when the bus arrived each morning. He had memorized that as well. At 11:10 a.m., people continued walking past him. A man brushed close to his shoulder and muttered an apology. Jordan did not respond. A woman glanced at him briefly and looked away. He did not follow her with his eyes. At 11:11 a.m., Jordan looked at the space where the bus had been. He focused on the empty section of road. Jordan held his gaze there longer than necessary. He tightened his jaw once. The movement was small. Jordan relaxed his jaw immediately after. At 11:13 a.m., Jordan lowered his eyes to the pavement. Jordan looked at the cracks in the concrete. Jordan had seen them before. He knew which ones were new and which ones had been there for years. At 11:14 a.m., the traffic light changed. Cars began to move through the intersection. Jordan did not step forward. Some people spent their mornings trying to arrive on time. Some people spent their mornings trying to arrive early. Jordan spent his mornings making sure he did not arrive too soon. At 11:15 a.m., the intersection cleared again. The sound of traffic softened. Jordan lifted his head slightly. At 11:16 a.m., Jordan turned away from the street corner. He turned his body in the opposite direction of the bus route. He took his first step away from the curb. At 11:17 a.m., he walked at a steady pace. He did not rush. He did not slow down. He walked as if he had nowhere else to be. At 11:18 a.m., the traffic light changed once more behind him. He did not look back. At 11:19 a.m., he continued walking. A few minutes earlier or later would have changed nothing. But these minutes mattered. They always had. Jordan reached his apartment building at 11:32. He slowed his pace as he approached the entrance. He pushed the door open with his shoulder. The door creaked. It always did. He did not react to the sound. Jordan climbed the stairs. He did not take the elevator. He never did. He placed his foot carefully on each step. He climbed without stopping. At 11:36 a.m., he reached the third floor. At 11:37, he stopped in front of his door. The door was plain. The paint was chipped near the handle. He took a key from his pocket. He unlocked the door. Jordan stepped inside and closed the door behind him. At 11:39, Jordan locked it. Jordan stood still for a moment after locking it. Jordan listened. The apartment was quiet. At 11:40 a.m., he removed his coat. He hung the coat on a hook beside the door. He adjusted the coat so it hung straight. He checked it once, then turned away. The apartment was small. One room, a narrow kitchen area, a table with one chair, a bed against the far wall. Everything had a place. Nothing was out of order. At 11:42 a.m., he walked to the kitchen counter. He placed his keys in a shallow dish. The keys made a soft sound. He watched them settle. At 11:43 a.m., he filled the kettle with water. He did not fill it to the top. He filled it to the same line he always used. He placed the kettle on the stove. At 11:44 a.m., Jordan turned the stove on. He waited. At 11:46 a.m., the kettle began to heat. He leaned lightly against the counter. He crossed his arms. He looked at the wall above the sink. The wall was bare. At 11:48 a.m., the kettle began to whistle. At 11:48, Jordan turned the stove off immediately. He did not let the sound continue. He lifted the kettle and poured the water into a cup. He did not spill any water. At 11:49 a.m., he placed a tea bag into the cup. Jordan did not add sugar. He did not add milk. He stirred once, then went still. He sat at the table, placing the cup in front of him, both hands wrapped around it. The warmth lingered against his palms. He studied the surface of the liquid without drinking. After a moment, he took a single sip, swallowed, and set the cup down. There was no reaction. He stood, carried the cup to the sink, rinsed it, and placed it upside down on the drying rack. He walked to the bed and sat slowly. His shoes came off and were placed side by side on the floor, toes facing outward. He stood again and opened the small drawer beneath the table. Inside were a few items: a folded receipt, a pen that no longer worked, a wallet with nothing inside. He looked at each one without touching them, then closed the drawer. He moved to the window and pulled the curtain aside just enough to look down at the street. Cars passed. People walked. No one held his attention. He let the curtain fall back into place, and the room dimmed. He sat on the edge of the bed, hands resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the floor. Then he stood and walked to the cabinet near the wall. He opened it. Inside was a single box. He removed it and placed it on the table. He stirred once, then went still. He sat at the table, placing the cup in front of him, both hands wrapped around it. The warmth lingered against his palms. He studied the surface of the liquid without drinking. After a moment, he took a single sip, swallowed, and set the cup down. There was no reaction. He stood, carried the cup to the sink, rinsed it, and placed it upside down on the drying rack. He walked to the bed and sat slowly. His shoes came off and were placed side by side on the floor, toes facing outward. He stood again and opened the small drawer beneath the table. Inside were a few items: a folded receipt, a pen that no longer worked, a wallet with nothing inside. He looked at each one without touching them, then closed the drawer. He moved to the window and pulled the curtain aside just enough to look down at the street. Cars passed. People walked. No one held his attention. He let the curtain fall back into place, and the room dimmed. He sat on the edge of the bed, hands resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the floor. Then he stood and walked to the cabinet near the wall. He opened it. Inside was a single box. He removed it and placed it on the table. He reached the small park 2 blocks from his apartment and entered through the same opening he always used. Once on the gravel path, his pace slowed. He did not look for a bench. He already knew which one he would take. It faced the street, allowing him to watch passing cars without turning his head. He sat carefully, lowering himself until the backs of his legs touched the bench, then easing his weight down. Both hands rested flat on his knees. He sat upright. The park was quiet, but not empty. Cars passed nearby. A cyclist went by without slowing. Somewhere behind him, a dog barked once and fell silent. He did not react. The sounds were allowed to exist without acknowledgement. After a moment, his eyes closed. His head did not tilt. His body did not shift. His breathing slowed. When his eyes opened again, he looked down near his shoes. A thin crack ran through the concrete. He followed it end to end, then looked away. He leaned back slightly. The metal pressed through his coat. He adjusted once, then became still. He thought about another morning. Years earlier, he woke in a different apartment. The alarm sounded once before he shut it off. He sat up immediately, feet on the floor, already moving. Clothes were waiting. The kitchen light came on. The room was brighter. The counter was wider. 2 cups sat near the sink. He filled the kettle and set it on the stove. The heat went on. He leaned against the counter while he waited, checked his phone once, then placed it face down. The rest of the morning was already planned in his head. Footsteps sounded behind him. She entered the kitchen and stopped near the doorway. A loose sweater hung past her wrists. Her hair was pulled back unevenly, as if she had not finished fixing it. She looked tired, but calm. She said his name quietly. He turned and smiled without thinking. He asked if she had slept well. She shrugged and said enough. She stepped closer and leaned against the counter beside him. They stood together in silence. The kettle began to whistle. He turned off the stove and poured the water into the cups, handing one to her. She wrapped her hands around it and watched the steam rise. She glanced at the clock and said they were running late. He said they would be fine. He drank quickly, set the cup down, picked up his bag, and moved toward the door. She asked him to wait. He stopped and looked back. She said they could walk together. He hesitated, checked the time again, and said he would miss the bus. She smiled slightly and said there would be another. He stood still longer than usual. Then he chose to leave. He stepped into the hallway and closed the door behind him. He adjusted the strap of his bag and walked faster than normal without turning around. At the corner, the bus was already approaching. He stepped closer to the curb, boarded quickly, and stood near the middle as the doors closed. He held the railing and watched the street slide past. Familiar buildings disappeared behind the bus. His phone vibrated in his pocket. He did not take it out. The bus slowed abruptly. A sound broke through the usual noise of traffic. It stopped. People stood at once. Voices overlapped. Someone asked what had happened. Someone else pushed toward the front. He stepped off the bus with the others. A crowd had gathered near the intersection. An ambulance stood nearby. He tried to move forward, but someone caught his arm and stopped him. A name was spoken aloud. He did not answer. He looked up at the clock mounted on the building and read the time. He did not blink. He did not move. He understood. Later, his eyes opened in the park. He was sitting exactly as before, hands still on his knees. His shoulders had lowered slightly. He looked down at his hands as if seeing them for the first time, turned them over slowly, then placed them back. He stood from the bench, adjusted his coat, and brushed a small amount of dust from the fabric. He glanced toward the street. Cars passed. Pedestrians walked by. No one noticed him. Nothing in the park had changed. The bench remained. The crack in the pavement was the same. Everything around him was intact. Time was not. He stepped away from the bench and walked out of the park. His pace was steady. He did not hurry. He did not slow. He walked as if the direction had already been chosen, even if it had not. The afternoon continued. He left the park and continued along the sidewalk at an unchanging pace. He did not look at the storefronts or check his phone. His gaze stayed level, fixed on the space ahead. People passed in both directions, some alone, some in pairs. He adjusted his path only when necessary. At the intersection, he waited for the signal, even though no cars were coming. He stepped off the curb only when it was allowed. He followed the rules closely now. The hospital came into view. The building was large and quiet in a way that did not feel calm. He pushed through the glass doors and stepped inside. The air was cooler. The floor reflected the overhead lights. He paused just inside the entrance and looked around. He approached the reception desk and waited while the person behind it finished typing. When she looked up, he gave his name. His voice was steady. He spelled it when asked and answered the questions that followed. When told to sit and wait, he nodded. He walked to the chairs along the wall and chose one at the end. He sat and placed his hands on his thighs, keeping his back straight. He did not lean against the chair. People moved around the room. A man paced back and forth. A woman cried quietly into a tissue. A nurse called out a name. Jordan did not react. At 1:45 p.m., Jordan was called into a small room. He stood up immediately and followed the nurse down a hallway. The walls were painted a dull color. Doors lined both sides. Jordan stopped when the nurse stopped. He waited while she opened one of the doors. Inside the room, there were 2 chairs and a desk. Jordan sat when he was told to sit. He folded his hands together and rested them on his lap. A doctor entered a few minutes later. The doctor closed the door behind him. He spoke slowly. He used careful words. He avoided certain phrases. Jordan listened without interrupting. Jordan nodded once. The doctor stopped speaking. The room remained quiet. At 2 p.m., Jordan stood up and left the room. He walked down the hallway alone. No one followed him. Jordan passed through the lobby and pushed open the front doors. The outside air felt warmer. Jordan did not stop walking. At 2:15 p.m., Jordan reached his old apartment building. Jordan stood outside the entrance for a moment. He looked up at the windows. He recognized which one had been his. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The hallway smelled the same. The light flickered briefly, then steadied. Jordan climbed the stairs without holding the railing. He stopped in front of the apartment door and removed his key. He unlocked the door and stepped inside. The apartment was exactly as he had left it. In the kitchen, he stood at the counter. 2 cups were still there, one empty, one untouched. He placed the empty cup in the sink without washing it. He lifted the second, held it briefly, then set it back down. He opened the refrigerator, looked inside without taking anything, and closed it again. Later, he sat on the couch, upright, hands on his knees. He stared at the bare wall across from him. He had never decided what to put there. Time passed without markers. He stood and went into the bedroom. Clothes hung neatly in the closet. He touched the sleeve of one shirt, then withdrew his hand and closed the door. Sitting on the edge of the bed, he removed his shoes and placed them side by side on the floor. He lay down on his back, arms at his sides, eyes open, breathing shallow but even. The room remained quiet. After a while, he returned to the kitchen and filled the kettle. When it whistled, he turned off the stove immediately and poured the water into a cup. He did not drink it. He sat on the couch again in the same position as before. The television stayed off. His phone remained untouched. A knock came at the door. He did not move at first. When it came again, he opened it. A neighbor stood in the hallway and spoke carefully. He listened and nodded once. When the neighbor stopped, he closed the door. He stood in the middle of the room and looked around. The couch, the table, the cups, the door. Nothing had changed. He picked up his phone and scrolled through missed calls and messages without opening any. He locked the screen and set it down. When he sat again, his posture was lower. His shoulders had dropped. His elbows rested on his thighs. He stayed that way. Light shifted across the floor as the afternoon faded. He noticed without reacting. He turned on a lamp, leaving part of the room dim. He returned to the bedroom and opened a drawer near the bed. He removed nothing and closed it. Sitting on the mattress, he pressed his hands into it once, then released. He lay down again and closed his eyes. He did not sleep. When he opened them, he stared at the ceiling. Eventually, he sat up, feet on the floor, unmoving. He stood and went to the window. The street below was busy with people returning home and cars filling the road. He watched without expression. He stepped away and turned off the lamp. The room darkened. He sat at the table, leaning forward slightly, hands on the surface. He did not eat or drink. The apartment stayed quiet. He stood and walked toward the door, stopped halfway, then turned back and sat down again. He stayed inside. The day ended without ceremony. Days passed without being marked. One morning, he woke and sat up immediately. He did not reach for his phone or remain still. His feet went to the floor, and he stayed seated for a moment, back straight, shoulders tight. The room was quiet. A narrow strip of light entered through the window. He stood and left the bedroom. In the bathroom, he washed his hands and looked at his reflection briefly. Not long enough to register details. His face appeared unchanged. He dried his hands carefully and turned off the light before leaving. He moved into the kitchen and opened a cabinet, removing a single cup. The kettle was filled and placed on the stove. He turned on the heat and waited. While the water warmed, he stood still, not leaning against the counter, not looking around the room. When the kettle whistled, he turned off the stove at once. He poured the water into the cup and added a tea bag. He did not add sugar or milk. He carried the cup to the table and sat down. Holding it in both hands, he watched the surface of the liquid as steam rose and slowly faded. He waited until it was gone before taking a single sip. He swallowed, set the cup down, and did not drink more. He stood and carried the cup to the sink, rinsed it, and placed it upside down on the rack. He adjusted it once so it aligned properly, even though nothing sat beside it. He put on his coat, checked the pockets, and took his keys from the dish near the door. He opened the door and stepped outside. He walked down the street at a steady pace, neither hurrying nor slowing. People passed in both directions. Cars moved alongside the sidewalk. He followed the same route he had taken many times before. At the corner, he stopped one step back from the curb and placed his hands in his coat pockets. He stood still. He did not look at the traffic light right away. He waited. When the bus arrived, he watched it slow and open its doors. He watched people step inside. He did not move. He did not step forward or raise his hand. The doors closed and the bus pulled away. He breathed out. He remained at the corner for a moment after it was gone. Cars passed through the intersection. Pedestrians crossed. He stayed where he was, then turned away from the curb and walked in the opposite direction of the route. He entered a small grocery store, picked up a basket, and moved through the aisles without hesitation. He selected a few items: bread, tea, milk, nothing else. He stood in line without shifting his weight. When it was his turn, he placed the items on the counter and paid, speaking only when necessary. He took the receipt, folded it once, and put it in his pocket. He left the store and walked back toward his apartment without taking any detours. Inside the building, he climbed the stairs without stopping, unlocked his door, and stepped inside. He put the groceries away, each item returning to its usual place. When the refrigerator door closed, he stood still for a moment, as if confirming that nothing was missing. He sat on the couch, upright, hands resting on his thighs, and stared at the wall across from him. The wall was empty. It remained empty. He stood and went to the window. Outside, the street was active. People moved with purpose. Cars passed. He watched without reacting. He returned to the table and opened the drawer beneath it. A few small items lay inside. He looked at them without touching anything, then closed the drawer. He lay down on the bed, on his back, arms at his sides, eyes on the ceiling. His breathing stayed even. He closed his eyes, then opened them again without sleeping. He sat up and placed his feet on the floor, hands on his knees. He stayed there for a long moment before standing again. In the kitchen, he poured another cup of tea. He did not drink it. He set it down and left it there. He sat back on the couch. His posture was lower now, shoulders slightly rounded, head tilted forward. He did not move. He picked up his phone and scrolled through messages without opening any. He locked the screen and placed it face down on the table. He remained still. The room stayed quiet. He stood, put on his coat again, picked up his keys, and left the apartment. At the street corner, he took the same position as before, one step back from the curb. When the bus arrived, he watched it stop. He watched the doors open. He watched them close. He did not move. Then he turned away and walked in the opposite direction. He reached the park and sat on the same bench. His hands rested on his knees. His gaze stayed forward. Light shifted around him. Sounds came closer, then faded. He remained seated. He stood and left the park, returned to his apartment, and removed his coat. He hung it on the hook and adjusted it until it hung straight. He sat at the table, placed his hands flat on the surface, and leaned forward slightly. He stayed there. He turned on a lamp. Light filled part of the room and left the rest dim. He did not change it. He sat on the bed and removed his shoes, placing them side by side on the floor. He lay down and stared at the ceiling. He turned onto his side, then onto his back again. He closed his eyes and opened them. Eventually, he turned off the light. The room went dark. Nothing dramatic happened during these days. No decisions were made. No words were spoken. No conclusions were reached. But something settled into place. His days began to repeat without resistance. Time no longer felt like something moving forward. It felt like something he stepped into, stood inside, and waited for. The days no longer felt separate. He woke and followed the same sequence without thinking. He sat up, placed his feet on the floor, stood, and left the bedroom. Each movement followed the last without pause or evaluation. In the bathroom, he washed his hands and dried them carefully. He glanced at his reflection for less than a second, then turned off the light and moved on. In the kitchen, he prepared tea the same way each morning. He used the same cup. The kettle was filled to the same level. He waited for the whistle and turned off the stove immediately. He poured the water and placed the tea bag inside. Nothing else was added. He sat at the table and waited for the steam to fade before taking a single sip. He set the cup down without finishing it, rinsed it, and placed it upside down on the rack. He adjusted it until it aligned perfectly. He put on his coat, checked the pockets, picked up his keys, and left the apartment. The walk to the corner required no attention. He followed the route without looking around. His pace even. People passed, some faster, some slower. He adjusted only when necessary. At the corner, he stopped one step back from the curb. His hands went into his coat pockets. He waited. When the bus arrived, he watched it slow. He watched the doors open. He watched people step inside. He did not move. The doors closed. The bus pulled away. Jordan breathed out. This sequence repeated. At first, Jordan stayed at the corner for a moment after the bus left. Later, he began to turn away immediately. He walked in the opposite direction of the route without hesitation. The decision no longer required effort. Jordan passed the same people often enough that he began to recognize them. A woman with headphones who always walked quickly. A man who smoked near the corner and flicked the cigarette away before crossing. A student who waited near the bus stop and checked his phone repeatedly. They began to recognize Jordan, too. The woman with the headphones glanced at him once, then again on another day. The man who smoked nodded slightly in Jordan's direction. The student looked at Jordan as if expecting him to move. When the bus arrived, Jordan did not acknowledge them. One morning, the student spoke. He asked Jordan if the bus was running late. Jordan looked at the student briefly. Jordan said nothing. The student waited a moment, then looked away. Another day, the man who smoked spoke to Jordan. He asked if Jordan was waiting for a different route. Jordan shook his head once. The man laughed quietly and said nothing more. The questions did not continue, but the looks did. Jordan became a fixed point at the corner. He was there every day. He stood in the same place. He missed the same bus. People began to expect it. Drivers slowed slightly when passing the corner. Pedestrians stepped around him without surprise. He was no longer part of the flow. He was part of the environment. Jordan noticed this. He did not react to it. After leaving the corner, Jordan followed the same loop through the neighborhood. He walked past the same storefronts. He passed the same park. He sometimes sat on the same bench. He placed his hands on his knees. He looked straight ahead. Sometimes he went into the grocery store. He bought the same items, placed them in the same basket, stood in the same line, and folded the receipt the same way. At home, everything went back to its place. He sat in the same chair. He lay on the same side of the bed. The lamp was turned on and off at the same points in the day. He stopped checking his phone entirely. Messages accumulated. Missed calls increased. Notifications stacked without being opened. The phone stayed face down on the table or in his pocket. Once, someone knocked on his door. He stood on the other side and did not move. The knocking stopped. Another time, a note was left under the door. He picked it up, read it once, folded it, and placed it in a drawer. He did not respond. The drawer began to fill. His world narrowed. Not suddenly, not dramatically. It narrowed through repetition. His apartment contained everything he needed. His route contained everything he expected. His corner contained everything he allowed himself to face. The watch remained in the cabinet. He did not open it often. When he did not touch the box. He only confirmed that it was still there, then closed the cabinet carefully. Some days, he stayed at the corner longer than usual after the bus left. He watched the empty street, the traffic lights cycling, people crossing. On those days, his chest tightened slightly. He did not step forward. He did not step back. He stayed where he was. Other days, he turned away as soon as the bus disappeared and walked without stopping. Those days passed more easily. He learned which days required stillness and which required motion. He did not question it. At night, he lay in bed and stared at the ceiling. He did not replay conversations or imagine different choices. He did not think in sentences. Thoughts arrived as images instead. The bus doors closing, the space at the curb, the empty seat inside, the road stretching forward. He did not attach meaning to them. He let them pass. Sleep came unevenly. Sometimes it did not come at all. When it did, he woke without feeling rested and rose anyway. The routine held. One morning, the bus waited longer than usual. The doors stayed open. People looked back. Someone waved him forward. He did not move. The driver looked directly at him. He held the gaze for a moment, then looked away. The bus left. The familiar release followed. The tension in his chest loosened. The moment passed. After that, the driver did not wait again. His absence became expected. It became normal. And in that normality, something hardened. He was no longer missing the bus. He was refusing it. The distinction mattered. He felt it in his body, in the way his feet stayed planted, in the way his breathing changed only after the bus was gone, in the way his shoulders settled. This was not avoidance anymore. It was control. He did not say the thought aloud. He did not need to. Each day reinforced it. Each repetition confirmed it. He stood at the corner and allowed the bus to leave. He walked away afterward without regret. Time no longer pushed him forward. He decided when it moved. The interruption did not arrive loudly. It did not announce itself. It did not force a reaction. It stood nearby and waited. He reached the corner and took his usual place one step back from the curb. His hands went into his coat pockets. His posture was familiar. His breathing settled into its established rhythm. The route was quiet. Traffic passed. Pedestrians crossed in small groups. He watched the movement without fixing on anyone in particular. Someone stopped beside him. He did not look at first. He registered the presence the way he registered a change in temperature. His stance did not shift. The person did not speak. He kept his eyes forward. The space beside him remained occupied. After a moment, he turned his head slightly. A boy stood there. He was younger than the others who waited at the corner. A backpack hung too low on his shoulders. The straps were loose. One of them twisted. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. The boy looked at the street, then at him. He looked back briefly and returned his gaze forward. The boy stayed. The bus approached. He watched it slow. He watched the doors open. People stepped inside. The boy moved forward and boarded. He remained where he was. The doors closed. The bus pulled away. He breathed out. The boy was gone. The corner returned to itself. The next day, the boy appeared again. He stood in the same spot, adjusted his backpack strap, and looked around. He did not speak. He was not acknowledged. The bus arrived. The boy boarded. He did not. The day after that, the same thing happened. The boy arrived just before the bus, stood beside him, waited, boarded. He remained. On the fourth day, the boy spoke. He asked why he never got on the bus. The question was direct. It was not whispered. It was not tentative. It was simply asked. There was no answer. The boy waited. Eyes forward. No response. The bus arrived. The doors opened. The boy looked at him again. He did not move. The boy boarded. The doors closed. The bus left. The question remained. The next day, the boy returned. He stood closer this time. He looked up and asked again. There was still no answer. The boy frowned slightly. He looked at the street, then back. He asked if he was waiting for someone. He shook his head once. The boy asked if he was afraid of the bus. There was no response. The bus arrived. The boy boarded. The pattern continued. The boy came every day and asked different versions of the same question. Why he stood there, why he did not move, why he let the bus leave. None of them were answered, but listening began. The boy spoke without hesitation. He talked about school, about homework, about people who were late and people who were early, about a teacher who locked the door when the bell rang. He listened without turning his head. The bus arrived. The boy boarded. He remained. The boy's presence changed the corner, not physically. The traffic lights still cycled. The bus still stopped. People still passed through, but the space beside him was no longer empty. One morning, the bus was late. The street waited. The boy shifted from foot to foot and looked down the road. He checked his watch. He stayed still. The boy asked if he was worried. He shook his head. When the bus finally arrived, the doors opened. The boy stepped forward. Before boarding, he turned back and looked at him. He asked if he wanted to come with him. There was no answer. The boy hesitated, then boarded. The doors closed. The bus pulled away. That morning, the familiar release did not come. Something stayed. The next day, the boy did not board right away. The bus arrived. The doors opened. He remained still. People waited behind him. The driver looked at the boy. The boy looked at him and asked again if he wanted to get on. He looked at the open doors. He felt his feet press into the ground. He shook his head. The boy nodded and stepped onto the bus. The bus left. The driver did not look back. That was the first day the pattern bent, not broken, bent. He noticed the change. He did not correct it. That night, he thought about the boy's questions. Not the words, but the fact that they had been asked. No one had asked before. People had assumed. They had glanced. They had moved around him. The boy had stopped and waited. The boy returned the next day. And the next. The questions continued, but they softened. He asked how long he had been standing there. A while. The answer was accepted. He asked if he worked somewhere. No. The boy nodded. He asked if he liked being late. There was no answer. The bus arrived. The boy boarded. The doors closed. He breathed out. But the release did not fully come. The corner no longer belonged only to him. Something had entered it, and it was not leaving. The boy did not change. He arrived with the same backpack. He stood in the same place. He boarded the bus when it came. Nothing about his actions shifted suddenly or dramatically. What changed was him. He began to notice the boy before he reached the corner, the rhythm of his steps, the way the backpack straps bounced against his shoulders. He did not turn to look right away, but he was aware of him. The boy spoke less. Some mornings he said nothing at all and stood quietly watching the street. On others, he spoke briefly, pointing out something ordinary: a stalled car, a dog straining at its leash, a man arguing into his phone. He listened. The bus arrived. The doors opened. The boy boarded. He remained. After the bus left, he no longer turned away immediately. He stayed longer, watching the space where it had been, waiting until the street resumed its usual rhythm. One morning, the boy asked if he had always stood there. He said, "No." The boy asked when he started. There was no answer. The bus arrived. The boy boarded. The question stayed. That night, he opened the cabinet and removed the box. He placed it on the table and opened it. The watch inside remained frozen. He closed the box but did not put it away. It stayed on the table overnight. The next morning, he returned it to the cabinet before leaving. At the corner, the boy asked if he had ever taken the bus. Yes. The boy asked why he stopped. There was no response. The bus arrived. The boy boarded. That day, there was no relief when it left. Instead, a dull pressure remained. It was not sharp or urgent. It did not demand action. It waited. Another morning, the boy arrived late. He looked rushed, adjusting his backpack straps and checking his watch. The bus approached. He stepped forward early, then paused. He looked back. He asked if he was sure he never wanted to go anywhere. There was no answer. The boy hesitated longer than before. People waited behind him. Someone cleared their throat. He boarded. The doors closed. The bus left. He stood alone. For the first time in a long while, the corner felt empty. Not quiet, empty. He noticed it immediately, in the space beside him, in the way his shoulders stayed tense, even after the bus was gone. The boy returned the next day and stood closer than usual. He asked a question he had not asked before. What would happen if he missed standing there one day? He looked at the street and said he did not know. The boy nodded. The bus arrived. The boy boarded. He stayed. That night, sleep did not come. He lay on his back and stared at the ceiling as images surfaced and faded. The corner, the curb, the open doors, the boy turning back. He did not push them away. He did not hold on to them. He let them remain. In the morning, the routine resumed. Tea, coat, keys. The walk. At the corner, the boy was already there. He asked if he had ever been late on purpose before. Yes. He asked if it felt better than being early. He considered it and said it felt quieter. The answer was accepted. The bus arrived. The boy boarded. He remained. But something shifted. Lateness no longer felt like a wall. It felt like a room, and the room was getting smaller. Another day, the boy said nothing. He stood beside him, waited, boarded, and left. The silence stayed. He noticed his feet pressing harder into the ground. He noticed his hands clenched inside his pockets. The release did not come. The next day, the boy asked if he ever waited for anything else. He answered honestly, no. The boy nodded slowly. The bus arrived. The boy boarded. He stayed. That afternoon, he sat at the table with his hands flat on the surface. He noticed how his fingers spread, the tension held in his wrists. He stood and went to the cabinet. The box was still there. He took it out and placed it on the table. He opened it. For the first time, he removed the watch. The metal felt cool in his hand. He turned it over, but did not try to wind it. He set it back in the box and closed the lid. He did not put it away. He left it where it was. The next morning, he stood at the corner and watched the boy approach. The boy asked if he wanted to know something. Yes. He said that some days he stayed on the bus longer than he needed to. He liked watching people get on and off, liked seeing who stayed and who left. He listened. The boy asked if he knew where he was staying. Yes. The boy asked if he wanted to stay there forever. There was no answer. The bus arrived. The doors opened. The boy stepped forward, then stopped. He looked back at him. The boy said he was getting off early the next day. He said he would stand at the corner even after the bus left. He looked at him. The boy boarded. The doors closed. The bus pulled away. He did not breathe out right away. He stayed still. The next morning, he reached the corner and took his place. The boy stood beside him. The bus arrived. The doors opened. The boy did not move. People waited behind him. The driver looked toward the door. He stayed. A sharp tightness formed in his chest. The bus waited. The driver cleared his throat. The boy looked at him and asked if he was ready to decide what standing there meant. He looked at the open doors. He felt the ground beneath his feet, the weight of his body, the watch at home, resting where he had left it. He did not step forward. He did not step back. He stayed. The boy nodded, stepped onto the bus, and the doors closed. The bus left. The corner settled back into stillness. But the meaning had shifted. He was no longer standing there to avoid something. He was standing there because he had not yet chosen what came next. And for the first time, that choice felt possible. The morning did not feel different when he woke. He sat up the way he always did, placed his feet on the floor, stood, and left the bedroom. Nothing in his body suggested urgency. Nothing indicated that this morning would require something new. He washed his hands and dried them without lingering at the mirror. The light went off. He moved into the kitchen. The kettle was filled and placed on the stove. He waited. When it whistled, he turned off the heat immediately, poured the water into the cup, and placed the tea bag inside. He stood and waited for the steam to fade. Before taking a sip, the taste was unchanged. He rinsed the cup and set it upside down on the rack, adjusting it until it aligned. He put on his coat, checked the pockets, and picked up his keys. Then he stopped. He stood near the table and looked at the cabinet. He opened it. The box was where he had left it. He took it out and placed it on the table. He opened it and looked at the watch inside. The hands remained frozen in the same position. He lifted the watch from the box and held it in his palm. The metal felt heavier than he remembered. He turned the watch over and pressed the side gently, not expecting a response. Nothing happened. He closed his fingers around it and stood still. He placed it in his coat pocket and closed the cabinet. He left the apartment. The walk to the corner felt unchanged. His pace stayed even. He followed the same route. People passed. Cars moved along the street. The city continued without noticing him. At the corner, he took his place one step back from the curb. The boy was already there. He noticed the slight bulge in the coat pocket, but did not comment. He adjusted his backpack and looked down the street. They stood side by side without speaking. The bus approached. He watched it slow. He watched the doors open. People stepped inside. The familiar sequence unfolded. He felt the watch in his pocket. He did not reach for it. The boy stepped forward, then stopped. He looked at him. He did not look back right away. He looked at the open doors. He looked at the space inside the bus. He noticed an empty seat near the middle. The driver waited. People behind the boy shifted. The boy asked if he was ready. There was no answer. He took one step forward. The movement was small, controlled. His foot crossed a line he had never crossed before. He stopped. His body reacted immediately. His chest tightened. His breathing shortened. His shoulders lifted slightly. He stood there. The boy waited. He took another step. He reached the curb. The doors stayed open. He felt the watch press against his side as he moved. His hand went into his pocket. His fingers closed around it. The metal was cold. He paused. He looked at the boy. The boy nodded once. He stepped onto the bus. The sound of his foot hitting the step was louder than he expected. He climbed inside. The doors closed behind him. The bus pulled away. He stood near the entrance and gripped the railing. His hold was firm. His knuckles lightened under the pressure. He did not sit. The boy stood nearby, watching him. He did not speak. He looked out the window. The corner slipped out of view. His chest tightened further. The urge came to step back, to reach for the door, to undo what had been done. His body resisted the forward motion. The bus kept moving. His breathing steadied, slowly. The boy smiled. He did not. They rode in silence for several stops. People boarded and exited. Voices overlapped. The engine filled the space. He remained standing. Eventually, the boy moved toward the door. He looked back and said it was his stop. He stepped off. The doors closed. The bus continued. He stayed inside. The space beside him felt unfamiliar. Not empty, unfamiliar. He reached into his pocket and removed the watch. He held it loosely and looked at the frozen hands. He closed his fingers around it again and returned it to his pocket. The bus slowed at the next stop. The doors opened. He did not move. The doors closed. The bus continued. Something shifted. Not relief, not regret, a recalibration. At the end of the route, he stepped off. He stood on the sidewalk and looked around. The area was unfamiliar. The buildings meant nothing to him. He did not know which way to go. He stayed still. People passed. He took out the watch and looked at it again. The hands were unchanged. The time no longer applied here. He returned it to his pocket. He chose a direction and began to walk. His steps were slow at first, then steady. No urgency, no avoidance. He walked. Eventually, he reached another bus stop. He stood one step back from the curb. A bus arrived. The doors opened. He stepped forward and boarded without hesitation. The doors closed. The bus moved on. This time, his chest tightened less. The pattern did not return completely. It did not disappear. It loosened. He rode for several stops and got off. He walked again. Later, he boarded another bus. Another time, he got off early. Another time, he stayed on longer. The movement continued. The city unfolded differently when he allowed it to carry him. By the time he returned home, the light outside had changed. He removed his coat, hung it on the hook, and adjusted it until it hung straight. He took the watch from his pocket and placed it on the table. He did not return it to the box. That night, he lay in bed and stared at the ceiling. Images came, the open doors, the step forward, the sound of the bus pulling away. He did not resist them. He did not hold on to them. He slept. In the morning, the routine resumed. Tea, coat, keys. At the corner, he took his usual place. The boy was not there. The bus arrived. The doors opened. He stepped forward. The doors closed. The bus moved. He did not look back. The corner receded into memory. It did not disappear, but it no longer held him. He was no longer standing still to control time. He was moving through it again. Not quickly, not carelessly, but willingly. And that was enough. The routine did not disappear after that morning. It changed shape. He woke and followed the same early steps. He sat up, placed his feet on the floor, stood, and left the bedroom. His body still remembered the order. In the kitchen, he filled the kettle and set it on the stove. He waited. When the whistle sounded, he turned off the heat immediately. He poured the water into the cup and placed the tea bag inside. He waited for the steam to thin before drinking. The tea tasted the same. He rinsed the cup and set it upside down on the rack, adjusting it slightly. He put on his coat, checked the pockets, and picked up his keys. Before leaving, he looked at the table. The watch rested there. He picked it up and turned it over in his hand. He did not try to fix it. He did not try to wind it. He placed it back where it could be seen. He left the apartment. Outside, the street moved at its usual pace. People walked. Cars passed. Nothing paused for him. He walked toward the corner. When he reached it, he stood one step back from the curb. His body still expected to wait. The bus arrived. The doors opened. He stepped forward without stopping. He boarded. The doors closed. The bus moved on. He stood near the window, holding the railing lightly. He did not grip it. He did not brace himself. He watched the street pass. At the next stop, someone stepped off. Someone else stepped on. He stayed. When a seat opened, he sat. His hands rested on his thighs. He sat upright and looked ahead. The ride continued. After several stops, he got off and walked through a neighborhood he did not know well. He noticed small details without assigning meaning to them. A store pulling down its shutters, a man washing his hands at an outdoor sink, a woman standing still while talking on her phone. He walked until he felt tired. then stopped. He sat on a low wall, resting his hands beside him, and looked at the street. After a while, he stood and walked again. Later, he boarded another bus and stayed on longer this time. He watched more faces. He listened without settling on any one conversation. When he returned home, the light outside had shifted. He entered the apartment, removed his coat, and hung it on the hook. He adjusted it once, then left it. He walked to the table. The watch was still there. He sat and looked at it. He remembered the first day he had placed it in the box, closing the lid carefully, deciding not to open it again. He reached out and touched the watch with 2 fingers. He did not pick it up. He stood and went into the kitchen, poured another cup of tea, and drank more of it than usual. That night, he slept without staring at the ceiling. The next morning, the boy was back at the corner. He stood beside him and adjusted his backpack. He looked over and smiled. He nodded once. The bus arrived. They boarded together and stood near the door. The boy talked about something unimportant. He listened. At the next stop, the boy stepped off and waved. He stayed on. The bus moved forward. Days passed. He took the bus some mornings and walked on others. Sometimes he stood at the corner longer than necessary. Sometimes he stepped forward immediately. The corner no longer controlled the decision. It was simply a place. He returned to the park occasionally and sat on the bench, watching the street. His hands rested on his knees. He stayed as long as he wanted. At home, he opened the drawer and removed the folded notes. He read them once. He did not respond to all of them. He responded to one. The watch stayed on the table for a while. Eventually, he moved it to the shelf by the window, where it caught the light. He did not fix it. He did not need to. It no longer measured his days. One afternoon, he stood at the corner and watched the bus arrive. The doors opened. A man beside him hesitated. He stepped forward first. The man followed. The bus moved on. He stood near the window and looked out. The corner slipped away behind them. He did not count the time. He did not need to. Later, he stood at the corner again. This time, he let the bus leave. He stayed where he was and watched it go. There was no tension, no relief, only choice. He turned away and walked, not to avoid the bus, not to control time, but because he had decided. That night, he stood in his apartment and looked around. The space was unchanged, but it no longer felt closed. He turned off the light and lay down. He slept. In the morning, he followed the routine again, not because he had to, but because it was his. The corner still existed. The bus still arrived. Time still moved forward. And he moved with it. Sometimes late, sometimes early. Always aware, always present. That was enough.